Hi, so we all know about the 20 rings of power, but how many of you know about the lesser magical rings that we definitely know did exist at some point? Today, that's what I'm going to be talking about, and it's hopefully going to be interesting. There are many magic rings in this world, Bilbo Baggins, and none of them should be used lightly. So, of course, the main rings of power, there were the 7 that were given to the dwarves, 9 to the men, 3 to the elves, and 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne. But there were several, and by several, probably about 50 lesser magical rings, and that is just a guess by myself. The reason I say that, though, is because it took them 90 years to create the 7 and the 9 between the years 1500 and 1590 of the Second Age. And this all occurred in Eregion, in the former Noldorin area of the Second Age, yeah. So that's where Celebrimbor, the grandson of Fëanor, created the magic rings and indeed the rings of power with the aid of Sauron, who was in a bit of a disguise at the time. However, it took them 300 years to get to the point where they could start making the rings of power. So that's 300 years where they're just making practice goes, or like having practice goes and like these like essays. So, you know, they're still magical, still very powerful, and you wouldn't want anyone, just anyone, to have one. But what could they actually do? So I did write them down. Like, here are the, because I can't remember all of these, there's too many, well, too many words. But Tolkien himself actually wrote this in a letter. It's a published work, so you can, like, I think there is a book on it. Letters from Tolkien to another gentleman. And these are the powers. So, a ring of power could either prevent or slow decay of the mortal world, that's one. Preserve what was desired or loved, that's the second. And then enhance natural powers of a possessor, even if disrupting the natural course of mortality. So those are the 3 powers that the magical rings had. Now, it's not to say that they did everything from scratch for the rings of power, because they didn't, which means that in the 300 years leading up to that, and the however many rings they made, there would have been a remnant of each of those powers within them, and they obviously wouldn't have been as powerful. But even if they were only 10% in that value, they still would have been really, really powerful. And for one of them to be like if they'd fallen into the hands of someone less than desirable and very despicable, then they could have caused a lot of harm to particularly the agents of the West, shall we say, because we're on the side of the good guys, right? However, we do know that the good guys probably didn't get their hands on them, because of course, whilst the rings of power, they were, well, the 7 and the 9 for the dwarves and men, they were created between 1500 and 1590 of the Second Age. The elven rings of power were then created after that, and so was the One Ring. And then there was the War of Sauron and of the Elves, rather, because Sauron was like, he realised that they realised that he'd been trying to trick them when he made the One Ring to kind of fall under his command. So then he was like, right, I'll take the rings back, and he went to war. So that culminated in the defeat of the Elves and the destruction of Eregion and the Gwaith-i-Mirdain, the people of the Jewelsmiths. And with that, all but the 3 elven rings were lost. So that obviously means, well, there's some speculation of whether or not one of the dwarven rings was given directly to Durin III of Khazad-dûm by Celebrimbor. But still to say that is 6 plus 9, or 15, quick maths. That's still 15 rings of power that were taken by Sauron. And he additionally would have taken all the lesser magical rings that, you would have just had lying around. I don't know. Maybe he would have just destroyed them. But it seems like far too much power to just throw away. Perhaps he gave them to someone else. We don't really know. But then just to touch on the power aspect of these lesser magical rings, like, let's say they're like 10% as powerful as, like, say the 9. Like, perhaps, yes, so they would enhance natural powers of a possessor, even if disrupting natural cause of mortality. Now, that would perhaps make them stronger or whatever, but then perhaps it wouldn't turn them into wraiths like it did to the ring wraiths, who of course had the 9. So if you put on a magical ring of power as a mortal, I should add, generally what happens is, so there's a divide between the physical realm and the wraith realm. So a mortal can only really exist in one plane, and if they put on the ring, they'll shift to the wraith world. If they have it for too long, then they can never go back to the physical world. This is kind of why, like, Frodo, Bilbo, Isildur, and Gollum, they went all invisible. So perhaps these lesser rings of power were given out to some of his chieftains of men, like out in the east and south, but they did eventually just die of natural causes because the ring just wasn't powerful enough to keep them alive. But it's not to say that the rings themselves still would have been around, and that is perhaps why also then Gandalf, during the events of The Hobbit, he perhaps knew that Bilbo, or perhaps guessed that Bilbo had the magical ring, or a magical ring, or an object of great power. I think or some kind of subtle power, I think he definitely did know that. But had it been a magical ring, then it could have been one of these lesser rings of power. Because, like, who would have thought that it would be the one ring? Because that had been lost for millennia at this point. And as we just discussed there, even a lesser ring of power on a mortal, on a hobbit, it would have caused them to be invisible, and therefore it would have, given a suitable alibi for how he managed to escape the goblin tunnels without being seen, for instance, and kind of traverse the Battle of the Five Armies so easily. This, of course, isn't an issue for dwarves because they're highly resistant to magic. And that is how they were created by Aule, the Smith Valor. And elves, of course, they are tied to the world. That is their fate, to be immortal, or rather have serial longevity, because they can obviously be killed, but then rehoused in Valinor. But they don't go invisible when they wear a ring of power. They weren't particularly designed for mortals, probably. Who's to say they were? Although, obviously, Celebrimbor perhaps did give the one dwarven ring to Durin III because of their friendship. But these are really just side effects of, what was it again? The ability to enhance natural powers of a possessor. So that's the main cause, and the invisibility is just a side effect. But I am really going on a tangent here anyway. But it's just interesting to think about these things, and who's to say there aren't still, as like 50, like even upwards of 30, surely, magical rings that are just unclaimed, perhaps in a troll horde. But let me know what you guys think. I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's just another one of these things that J.R.R. Tolkien, because he just left a lot of things quite unfinished in his tales, it just opens the doors really to talk about these things, and it's just really quite interesting, I thought. But anyway, this kind of segues quite nicely into next week's video that I'm going to kind of in this talking head format, and that is going to be on whether or not, or rather discussing why Sam and Bilbo are the true heroes of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and Frodo's just a side character. So join me for that if you want. Like this video also if you do find these interesting, because obviously the last video I asked you guys to like it. If you liked it, and many of you did, so thank you very much. It means that you know, it gives me a precedent to keep doing these. So subscribe if you want to catch the next video in this kind of mini series, whatever you want to call it, and like it if you liked it. Again, comment something as well, join a discussion, we'll have a chat. I'm going with Gandalf. Good day.